All right, I am pleased to introduce Susan. She is a plant biologist who began her career studying wildfires, grizzly bear habitat, and sagebrush communities in Yellowstone National Park before evolving into a writer. Her 13 books and hundreds of articles and essays consider the nature of life and our place in it. Her new memoir, Bless the Birds, Living with Love in a Time of Dying, won a Sarton Award and was a finalist for the Colorado Book Awards. Susan's habitat restoration projects range from power plant sites to urban pocket parks and have been recognized by the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Rockies, and the North American Rock Garden Society, and of course, CONIPS. Susan spent 20 years restoring a blighted industrial property and is adjacent block of Urban Creek in Salida. And that is what we're going to hear about today. So without further ado, thank you so much, Susan. We look forward to hearing from you. And folks, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And at natural breaks in the talk, we'll address those questions. And then at the end, we can have a open question section.
And when Maggie says at natural breaks in the talks, that means that if I pause for breath for long enough, she's going to tell me there's a question, because once I get going, I'm just rolling along. So feel free to put your questions in the chat. All right, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So first, I want to say thanks to y'all for being here. And I'm getting over walking pneumonia, so if I start losing my voice, it'll come back in a minute. Thanks to Maggie and CONIPS. It's just a delight to get to give this talk. This is a project that is very dear to my heart, even though I don't live there anymore. The Ditch in the Meadow, it's my longest running and most accidental ecological restoration project, which took place in the little town of Salida, Colorado, in south central Colorado in the mountains. And I want to start by doing something that I don't usually do, which is quote myself. This quote is from my first memoir, Walking Nature Home, A Life's Journey. The photograph, and all the photographs in here, is mine. All the others are too. That is a two-tailed swallowtail on a Cleome lutea Rocky Mountain bee plant, one of the best pollinator flowers in the Rocky Mountains from my point of view, and one of the easiest ones to use in ecological restoration. It's an annual, and it just is a great one to seed in and then watch who comes to nectar from it. A civilized society is created as much by our private everyday acts as it is by the laws we pass and the contracts we sign. Our personal behavior sets the model for what we expect of others. And my point in saying that is to say, it's often the really small everyday things that we do that make the most difference in our lives and in other lives. And that's certainly the case with this project. When my late husband and I moved to Salida, his childhood hometown, he was taking a break from academics, and I was homesick for the Rockies. And so we moved there when our daughter went off to college. And we moved into a little tiny duplex, a railroad workers duplex built in 1904 that we bought from a slumlord. It had trees growing through in between the baseboard and the walls, and it was a mess. And we rehabbed it, but it was tiny, and we needed a bigger space. So we looked for a place where he could have a sculpture workshop and then eventually build our own house. He had always wanted to build a house with his own hands. And it turned out that our dream place was right across the alley from our duplex. This is it. Doesn't it look like your dream place? No, right? Right across the alley from our duplex was a half a block of formerly industrial property. And it was in such bad shape in our wrong side of the former railroad tracks neighborhood in Salida that most people didn't even notice it was there. It had a chain link fence around it with 3 strands of barbed wire on top. And the half block was full of junk. The Mustang does not count as junk. We didn't get that when we bought the property. The owner took it away, nor does the giant air compressor on the left side of the picture. Or the antique gas tanks. None of those were junk. But he did leave behind the leaking hydraulic lift from someone's auto repair shop that was leaking into the soil, and the buildings that were falling down and we had to take down. The one building that we left is the one right here that we bought the property for. It was a 1,600 square foot millwork shop built in 1902. And everything about it leaked. The roof leaked, the walls leaked, the windows leaked, but it was a perfect sculptor's studio. We bought this piece of property because we were crazy, I think. And I fell in love with what bordered the property, and that's this creek, which the locals called a ditch. It's not an irrigation ditch, it's a spring-fed creek, but it was treated as if it was a ditch. And it lined one whole side of the property. And I'd always, my whole life wanted a creek to play with. And by play with, I mean not catch crawdads in, but restore. And this one was plant ecologist's dream. It was filled with trash. It had been straightened in the 1890s when the railroad platted out Salida, and it had been dredged much later because it was a flood risk to downtown. And you can see from the size of the creek that it's definitely a flood risk. I have no idea what anybody was thinking when they thought it was a flood risk, but it was full of trash. The banks had, as far as I could tell, not a single native plant on them. They had been industrial for more than a century by then. It was no one's dream, just as the property was no one's dream, but I fell in love. When we bought the property, I said to Richard, my late husband, all right, you restore the shop and build the house. I'm going to replant a native dryland mountain grassland around the house when you build it, and I'm going to restore the block of creek. And he said, sure, of course. I think he had the easier job, but I'm not sure. We started by clearing the industrial debris from the property, and it was in such bad shape that this is how it was cleared. We had a friend with a track hoe come one Saturday and comb the soil with the track hoe bucket, with the teeth of the track hoe bucket, and he would hit something in the soil and the bucket would shake, and he would grab whatever it was, and I would send up a silent prayer that it wasn't something toxic, and he would lift it out of the soil and shake it and put it in the dump truck that was waiting to haul off 6 dump truck loads of industrial debris, partly or mostly buried in the soil of our half block property. Right here, the track hoe is clearing away most of the containment wall for the 5 above ground oil tanks that had sat there, none of which leaked enough to actually leak through the soil profile into the creek. I was relieved to find out. We kept part of that wall because I wanted a raised bed vegetable garden, and I thought it would be really appropriate to use the containment wall for the above ground oil tanks, what was left of it, the U-shaped bit that was left, as the garden wall for my garden. It seemed like a good repurposing. When we bought the property, I had no idea what I was getting into, to be honest. I didn't imagine I would spend the next 19 and a half years working on the creek and restoring the dryland mountain prairie around the house. But that's what I did. And I started with weeding. As you do in ecological restoration, the first thing you do in any kind of restoration project is evaluate what's there. And I did a thorough survey of the property and the block of creek bank. And it was depressing, I have to say. There were 3 important plants in terms of their biomass. Cheatgrass, which is a Eurasian annual weed from, it's an annual grass from Eurasia, and it's very, very flammable and grows very densely. You can see it in this picture. It grows so densely, it chokes out everything else, and it's called cheatgrass, CHEAT grass, because it comes up really green really early. It's a winter annual and looks fabulous. And then as soon as the soil dries out, it does what annual plants do, which is go to town and produces 1.5 tons of seeds. I'm exaggerating, per plant. Each of those plants probably have 50 seeds on them. So you can do the math if you figure that there's per square foot, I'm going to say 50 to 75 plants. That's a whale of a lot of seeds. It's really easy to pull, but it also grows really densely. So there was cheatgrass, there was kochia, which is another Eurasian gift, an annual forb. you would call it a wildflower, except the flowers are so tiny you can't notice them. Also called Mexican fireweed. Grows about 6 feet tall when it's really happy, and it has a pyramidal shape and striped red stems. And it's another copious cedar because it's an annual plant. And then there was tumbleweed, which you all know, the round, marvelous tumbling plant that has an abscission layer, a layer that breaks off above the stem when it dries out and then tumbles across the landscape, dropping some of its 200,000 or so seeds with each bounce. And Siberian elm. That was pretty much the flora of our decaying industrial empire, as we took to calling it, which meant all of that had to go if I was to reestablish anything native. So the first thing I did was weed. Every single weekend for most of the first growing season, I pulled sheetgrass, I pulled kochia, I pulled tumbleweed, I grubbed out Siberian elms with a 50-pound bar. And you can see some of the weed bags in the back of my Subaru right there. I hauled away utility trailers worth of weeds, pounds and pounds and pounds. In the case of annual plants, when you're weeding, you have to take the whole plant out because you have to get the seeds out of there, and they have to go in sealed bags to the dump because you don't want to gift anyone else with those seeds. The plants really aren't that important. It's the seeds you want out of there. And the easiest thing is to pull the whole thing and put it in bags. I did a lot of weeding, a lot of weeding. And when I had cleared areas, I decided what I would start by planting. I had no budget. I was doing this on my own because it was our property, and I got stubborn. And but I had a source for tubelings, which are plants grown in small tubes. They're mostly root, very little top. And I picked 6 native shrubs to recolonize the creek bank. Rubber rabbit brush, which is Erica marianosiosa, which you see right here in the inset with the beautiful painted lady butterfly on it. It's a pollinator magnet, and it grows on it would grow on the driest parts of the bank. And big sagebrush, which is on the left of the screen there with the 3-parted hairy leaves, a marvelous, marvelous native shrub that has a beautiful fragrance that some people hate and some people love, which would also grow more on the top of the bank. And then Indian plum, which is the white flowering shrub there, closer to the stream where the soil would be wetter, and golden currant, the one on the lower right, which is one of the earliest bloomers in the Front Range and also the mid-mountains in Colorado. It blooms when the first hummingbirds start migrating in. So it's another great pollinator shrub, and its berries are fabulous for songbirds in migration. So that's 4. 3-leaf sumac was another. And I'm losing, red twig dogwood, which would also go down by the creek. And I started with plants that would basically reweave the community. And native plants do that. They provide the structure. So as they grow, they provide the mass, the perches for birds, the branches for native bees to drill into and lay their eggs, the housing, basically. They provide the food in terms of pollen and berries and nectar and buds and all the other things, root tips and all the other things that get eaten. They exhale oxygen, which we inhale. Plants are our breathing buddies. We breathe out carbon dioxide, which they need to inhale, and they breathe out oxygen, which we need to inhale. So it's a reciprocal relationship in general, if not in time. They provide the materials that birds need to weave their nest, or insects need to nest in, all that kind of thing. And they also provide the relationships. Native plants exude invitations in the form of volatile organic chemicals through their roots and also through their branches and flowers that insects in particular and microbes in the soil smell and migrate into. So native plants literally call in the other lives that reweave ecosystems. So I started along the creek with this backbone of 6 native shrub species because the creek itself had been a shrub riparian creek, not a tree riparian creek. There had been scattered trees along it, but mostly shrubs were the kind of the backbone there. You can see examples of what these plants do as they got bigger here. That's a Cedar waxwing on the left in a golden currant. The dark berries are golden currant berries, and the cedar waxwings in the fall would come in and just gorge on those berries. Dark berries, dark colored berries are full of antioxidants, and those antioxidants are an important part of keeping birds healthy as they migrate. They're also full of lipids and other fats that birds need as they migrate. So they're important power foods for migrating songbirds. Up on the upper right are the one of the native plants that volunteered along the Blackhawk Creek about 3 years in, as the shrubs were starting to be visible and I was really getting a handle on the invasive weeds and starting to seed in wildflower and native grass seeds. I noticed two showy milkweed plants appear right above the creek, about 2/3 of the way down the block, and got pretty excited. It was on the city side of the creek, so my late and I owned one creek bank, and the city of Salida owned the other, and there was a major trail corridor going along the other side where the railroad had used to run. So when I found plants that I wanted the city not to whack back to the roots, I would flag them. And eventually I asked the city to just let me manage that side of the creek, because their way of managing it was in the fall to send the prisoners from the county jail with hand weed whackers to tidy up the creek bank, which they would do all the way to the dirt. And when it was still annual weeds, they did that just as the annual weed seeds were ripe and spread them beautifully so that the annual weed crop multiplied. And when native plants started to sprout through, they cut those right back to the soil too, because it looked tidier. So first I flagged plants, and then I eventually took over that side of the creek, and they let me manage it, not knowing what I was doing, which was probably good. They would probably have objected if I told them I was restoring a native ecosystem along the creek, but by the time it looked good, they were on board. So on the lower right is a Rocky Mountain penstemon with one of our great pollinators that does the evening and early morning shift. It's a white-lined sphinx moth, which can fly earlier than other pollinators because they have the ability to shiver their flight muscles asynchronously, so their wings don't hover, but they create warmth, and so they can fly in cooler temperatures than other pollinators. They're kind of the hummingbirds of the early morning and late evening. And they also, hummingbirds have it difficult enough hovering and sticking their brush-like tongue into a flower to sop up the nectar. White-lined sphinx moths and other pollinating moths have a straw-like tongue called a proboscis that they carry rolled up under their upper lip, and while hovering, and it's about a little thicker than the diameter of a human hair, while hovering, they unroll that proboscis, straighten it out, and drop it down into the flower's throat, which is not something I think you want to try at home. They're amazing pollinators. Anyway, those are some of the early native plants that moved in along the creek, and some of the pollinators they called in. Are there questions yet, Maggie? Should I stop? That would be a no, I'm
There
guessing.
are no questions yet, just comments.
Cool. All right. While I was doing my plant thing, because I am a plant geek, my late husband was building. The building you see sheathed in with windows and roof is what became our house. It was a passive solar house, which was designed to fit the neighborhood architecture and the industrial site. And that's my late below. He was a sculptor who worked with native rocks as ambassadors of the earth. His arm is around a flake of granite that came from the property that he was carving into a sink for one of the bathrooms in the house. So I'm obsessed about plants. He was obsessed about rocks, matching obsessions. This is an after picture, just to give you an idea of where we were headed with this. There's the house. In the inset picture, you can see the front yard, which is not a lawn. And the flowers you see in the big picture are actually the pocket park next door on a piece of city property that I'll tell you a little bit more about later. They're all pollinator flowers, mostly native. So we were building this sustainable house on this formerly industrial property. Our neighbors thought we were crazy. And while I was working on the creek, I started experimentally restoring the yard of the house into a meadow. a native dryland meadow that would have been there before the railroad came and platted out the town of Salida, when that part of the valley was dryland meadow. And it was spring pronghorn habitat and bluebird habitat in summer, mountain bluebird habitat. So I had this idea that even though it was an industrial site, and what we were calling soil was 4 inches of compacted road base on top of layers of fly ash and other industrial leavings, I thought, well, I obviously can't put sod there, and I wouldn't anyway. That's not the way I go about things. I thought, well, if any plants can make it there, I could recreate a dryland native prairie. So I called Alex and Suzanne Tonneson of Western Native Seed in Coaldale, Colorado, who are my favorite native seed suppliers. And I said, okay, so I'm working on the decaying industrial empire, and I want to do a dryland meadow in the front yard. Will you guys make me up a seed mix? And they came to town one weekend, looked at the site and looked at me and looked back at the site and looked at me and were like, okay, you think you can grow something here? And I said, yeah, I do. So they made me up a mix and they brought it to town the next time they came into town, and they called it road-based mix. And it was a dozen or 14 native grasses, native wildflowers, and some subshrubs, fringe sage and prairie sage, that they thought might be tough enough to germinate in my lack of soil. So that fall, which is when you seed in native seeds in the Rocky Mountains, that fall I took a stiff tined rake out to one edge of the property, and I just raked long furrows cross the prevailing wind direction in the road base to loosen it a little bit and make furrows that would hold the seeds when the wind blew in the winter. And then I spread seeds and I covered them with a layer of Christmas tree mulch about an inch thick, meaning the mulch from grinding up Christmas trees that the city gave away free. And then I snaked a soaker hose through the whole 75-foot by about 20 feet wide experimental seeding. And on warm mornings in the winter, about once a month, I would attach the soaker hose and run it for a couple of hours and pretend we were having a wet snow. It was a particularly dry winter, so I felt like nothing would happen if I didn't give it kind of a boost. And come spring, things germinated, much to my great surprise. I went out there in April and I ran and got my husband from his studio. He was working on some commission or other. And I just made him come out and look, because there were little green things coming out, and they were not cheatgrass, tumbleweed, or kochia. They were actual native plant seedlings, and they were tiny, and they didn't get much bigger. About a month later, when you could actually see them, and they were maybe 2 inches tall, I called Alex and Suzanne and said, you have to come look, you have to come look. And they did, and they stood there on the sidewalk with their mouths open. We were all astonished that anything germinated. And what you see is about 4 years later, when the plants had gotten their roots through the compacted road base and so could get taller, the first year they stayed about 3 inches tall. But they all bloomed. The wildflowers did, and the grasses too. And what was so cool is, you see those red flowers in there? Those are whole leaf Indian paintbrush, Castanea integra, which would be the native paintbrush there. They were not in the seed mix. They weren't in the seed mix as a pollutant. They were not in the seed mix at all. They sprouted when two actually of their companion plants, prairie sage and blue grama grass, sprouted. The grass and the prairie sage effused their chemicals of communication into the soil, and the Indian paintbrush seeds that may have been there for a century sprouted, because they knew the companion plants they needed to grow were there. I've talked to a number of people about this, trying to figure out, surely some other thing happened there. And the only possible answer is that those seeds had been there for about a century. And when their particular natives, their companion plants returned, they returned too. So super, super cool. That was, we were all so jazzed about that. And then a couple of years later, when the front yard was looking like this, we put up a bluebird box by the raised bed vegetable garden that I was growing. And just kind of, I had gotten it as a thank you for doing a talk at an Audubon Society meeting. And I didn't really figure any bluebirds would appear. I'm in downtown Salida, Colorado. I haven't ever seen any bluebirds in my neighborhood. There is no bluebird habitat there except my front yard. Sure enough, a pair of bluebirds moved in, raised a brood of 5 kids that summer, and ate every single freaking grasshopper in my yard. It was fabulous. Best insect, best pest eradication I've ever had for free. They recognized my meadow as the mountain grasslands that they live in summer, even though it was all of, I don't know, half a tenth of an acre. It had the right look, smell, and feel. And so they moved into that bluebird box, and they came back for several years. And then one year tree swallows beat them to it. And so they didn't nest that year. They came back a couple years later. And this is the kitchen garden, just so you have that reference, within the containment wall of the old above ground oil tanks. Raised beds because, hello, if I'm going to eat what comes out of those beds, I am not growing it in the soil that I never found toxins in it, never tested for toxins, but it wasn't soil I wanted my vegetables to be absorbing the nutrients from. So I built raised beds, which are much easier to work with anyway, and filled them with way more produce than we could have ever used. We routinely took produce to friends and took it to Denver to my parents and gave away lots of garden produce, which was a lot of fun. It's really lovely to have an abundance of produce. And it also was great, the vegetable garden, because I am an organic gardener. It was a great habitat for, that's the tree swallows in the bluebirds box. Squash bees, our native squash bees, in a squash flower, a little rufous hummingbird who really loved the, I seeded pollinator flowers in with the vegetable garden, Rocky Mountain bee plant and other pollinator flowers. And that rufous hummingbird spent most of a late summer picking aphids off of the lettuce and drinking nectar from the Rocky Mountain bee plant, along with the swallowtail butterflies and all the others. So I had a cool little ecosystem going there on this formerly industrial site. And a big part of what kept it so diverse was having the creek revegetation, creek restoration project, and then that front yard dryland native meadow. I saw wildlife people in my neighborhood had never seen, pollinators and songbirds in particular. So it was very, very rewarding. And here's the creek 10 years in. You can see in the inset what it looked like when I first saw it. And this is approximately the same point that the picture is taken from. What's on the left is a native cottonwood tree that I planted when we did the pocket park that's right to the left, which I'll talk about in a minute. And then what you see along the creek are that billow is streambank willows, which were one of my finds when I got the city to let the prisoners not take care of the creek. I found 2 clumps of streambank willows about this big, and they had been sheared every year to about this high. And as soon as I flagged them and they didn't get cut anymore, streambank willows are a native rhizomatous willow that grows stalks about 10, 12 feet high, and then will spread along the creek in the zone of soil that is its moisture content. And they spread along about 2/3 of that block of creek in a little less than 10 years, and shaded the water, dropped organic matter in it, or habitat for all sorts of pollinators and songbirds, made a big difference in the quality of the water in the creek. So that was my freebie restoration plant. They were great. There's also Indian plum in there. The reddish stuff down the creek is chokecherry, a native chokecherry, which in fall, every year I found bear poop under that chokecherry. A black bear would come wandering down the creek from the mountains and stop at the chokecherry and eat like crazy and leave behind a sign of its presence in the form of a large bear poop studded with pits. So the creek changed a lot over those first 10 years and continued to. It was really, really rewarding. I would be out leading along the city side, and people would be biking and walking. It's a major commuter path in Salida from the outer edge of town down to the river. And this creek, by the way, drained into the Arkansas River right in the middle of a stretch of 150 miles of gold medal trout water. So restoring that block was part of restoring the water quality in the creek, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the path was this huge commuter path. People biked and skateboarded and walked it, and I'd be out there weeding, squatting on my hands and knees, pulling weeds, and they would stop and say, "What are you doing?" And I would explain, and sometimes they'd stop and help me for a little while. It was just it was the best way to spread the word, I guess, about native plants and restoration. And here's another view of the creek. The reddish tinged plant in the front is red twig dogwood, which I planted 4 tublings of, and they grew to be 12 feet high and about 8 feet across in about 5 or 6 years. They were very happy there. And other plants that I seeded in or foraged. The top picture is blanket flower, Gaillardia aristata, with some whole leaf Indian paintbrush that I seeded in along the creek. That brought a lot of pollinators in. And the bottom is Rocky Mountain iris, our native iris, which I found several clumps of uprooted by a road grader out in the county. They had been scraped when the road grader scraped the county road, and they were uprooted upside down. And I figured, all right, that's my clue to forage them. And I brought them back to the creek and planted them on sort of a little terrace just above at the high water mark. And they did very, very well. They were really beautiful along there. There's red twig dogwood in the front in the winter. That's looking up the creek from the lower end. An Indian plum and the stream bank willows. Top is more showy milkweed, which spread its way all along one bank of the creek, which was great. We went from no monarchs in town to my high count was 3 dozen monarchs and 24 caterpillars that actually made it to adults 1 year. The population kind of fluctuated up and down with whether we were in a drought or not, but it was really great to have monarchs appear back in the neighborhood. And then on the bottom right is Colorado's one perennial sunflower that's a riparian plant, and that came back on its own as soon as I had gotten the weeds down to the point that other plants had space. The biggest problem of invasive weeds in some ways, most invasive weeds, especially annual ones, is they simply take up all the available space. And so there's no root space, there's no aerial space, there's no nutrients, there's no water for other plants. And it's amazing what appears when you remove the thickets of annual weeds. And this sunflower, Nuttall sunflower, Helianthus natalii, which is this fabulous perennial sunflower, lined one whole part of the creek right along at the bottom. And in the fall, the goldfinches clambered all over it like little parrots. It was great. So that was another one that came back on its own. So while we were weeding and planting and building, a funny thing happened to our neighborhood, which was one of the coolest parts of this accidental project to me. This triplex, which was built the same year as our duplex, was just down the block from us and is pretty much indicative of the West 2nd Street neighborhood in Salida when we first moved there. I don't know, perhaps 2 or 3% of the houses were actually vacant. It was the wrong side of the former railroad tracks, and it was a very poor down at the Heels neighborhood. And this triplex was abandoned at that time, and its yard was cheatgrass, a very verdant growth of cheatgrass. There were frame buildings that were tumbling down. There were houses that were in pretty bad shape. Some of them were well kept, but a lot of them were in pretty bad shape. And as we cleared away the junk from our lot and began restoring the buildings, building our house, and I began restoring the prairie and the creek, the neighborhood changed slowly, gradually, but it did change. This is a couple of duplexes, and they'd been okay when we moved in. They were occupied, but not in great shape. And the porches got painted and gardens appeared out front. And interestingly enough, some of the native wildflowers from my front yard, Meadow, migrated down the block to some of the gardens. In some cases, neighbors would stop by and ask if they could gather seeds. And in other cases, the harvester ants, the ants that make the big mounds that have a fierce sting, they're seed gathering ants. And they move seeds a long way. A female harvester ant will go up to 250 feet from the nest and can carry 10 times her weight in seeds. And the harvester ants helped move the seeds to other yards in the block, in particular to the hell strips, the space between the street and the sidewalk. So wildflowers from our restored prairie moved through the neighborhood, which was pretty cool. But the neighborhood really did take a big step upward, and a lot of gardens sprouted, including this one, which still is the Salida Community Garden. It's 32 garden plots, including a couple of raised ones for wheelchair folks, that sprouted on a vacant lot that had been vacant for a long time next to the abandoned triplex. A group, as we started restoring our place, a group of neighbors got together and came and talked to me about what they might do to get a lease on this vacant lot and who they might talk to, and how to organize a nonprofit to start this garden. And they did. They got a lease from the owner. I think it's a 50-year lease, it may be a 100-year lease, and started the Salida Community Garden and rented garden plots to people who didn't have garden space for edibles or whatever else. And it's still a thriving garden. And having that on one corner in this neighborhood really made a big difference. Questions, Maggie?
So far, no questions, but lots. Oh, one just came in, but lots of praise. Okay. Which nurseries sell native plants? Welcome, Gary Rapp.
That, CONIP's website, I believe, has a list of nurseries that sell native plants. Is that true, Maggie?
That is absolutely true. And also this year, all of our garden tours will end with a plant sale or plant giveaway, depending on what chapter it is. So
And if,
those things will come out in the next couple days in our next e-juice.
and if you're in Colorado on the Front Range, the High Plains Environmental Center, which is in Loveland, has a plant sale every year that's fabulous. They have a big nursery and they grow a lot of native plants. So that's another option too. So there you are.
Yeah, High Plains is our nursery partner for the Northern Chapter Garden Tour, so that's on June 30th.
Yeah, and they grow a really good variety of plants, native plants, very well adapted to the region, seeds collected in the area, all that good stuff. So here we are with our half block of formerly decaying industrial area at the edge of this neighborhood that was pretty down at the heels, wrong side of the former railroad tracks and all that stuff. And one end of the block that our half block was on, a very small piece, less than 1/10 of an acre, was owned by the city of Salida. It was a result of a street realignment. And when we bought the property, they were using it as a collection point for street sweepings. And you all know what comes up street sweepers, trash and all of the little micro metal fragments that come out of car tailpipes and the bits of rubber that come off of tires and all the snow removal gravel and all that kind of stuff. And they were just stored in piles there. And it was at the upwind end of the block. And so you know what happened to the piles when the wind blew. And then in the winter, they would store piles of snow there, dirty street snow. So it wasn't really a lovely addition to the neighborhood. And at one point, some friends of mine and I were talking about our project, my accidental project, and they said, why don't we see if the city would lease us or allow us to put a pocket park to demonstrate the kinds of plantings that you're using in your yard as a public pocket park. It was right across from this popular trail. We thought we could put in a little picnic area and maybe some interpretive signs and maybe a water fountain for trail users and that kind of thing. And so we went to the city and went to the city council and said, we'd like to do this with this little bit of land if the city will allow us. And the city council looked at us and said, absolutely, you design it, you get the money, you figure it out, you can do it. And we looked at each other, it was 3 women, and we looked at each other and went, fine, we'll do it. And we did. We got a grant from Colorado's lottery grant funds, Great Outdoors Colorado, a mini grant. And I designed the park on the back of a napkin. It was basically a couple of mounds encircling it and plants that would be native or regionally adapted that would attract pollinators and songbirds to show people how to garden in other ways than just lawns. Salida at that time had just given everyone in town a water meter. we had been a town that had never metered our water until the state required us to do it. And so people had lawns like crazy, even in the old parts of town, because if you don't have to pay for but a monthly fee, if you don't have to pay for the amount you use, you can have whatever you want. And it was just at the point where the water meters had been in for a year and people were in shock at their water bills when we put the park in. And so it was a really great, we hit the right wave, I guess. It was a really great thing for the public. And it was just a little tiny park. And we ended up getting a grant to put in interpretive signs about the railroad and the town history, and the creek, and about the native plantings there. And my late husband designed the little kiosk that you see in the lower right with the, I think those are first graders. And the schools started bringing kids there on field trips. And it was just it was one of those projects that was really super rewarding, tiny, but super rewarding. And because it was next to my property, I did a lot of weeding over there. I don't know who's weeding it now, but for a lot of years I did the weeding. But it was a great project. And the local Rotary got excited about it, and they bought a tremendously expensive, like a $5,000 water fountain that was frost-free and had a dog drinking bowl. It was the only water fountain in downtown Salida. Very popular place. Water fountains are underrated. Across the street, across the creek from our property was this public trail on the old railroad grade that ran through Salida, the old narrow gauge grade. It was, at that time, it ran 5 miles from the river to outside town, and it was a super popular trail. And as the creek started looking better, one of the local nonprofits got the idea that they would work with the city and the county to start moving the restoration up and down the trail from the block I had been working on for years, to control some of the invasive weeds, to start planting natives, and generally improve the trail all the way along. And they eventually put together this collaboration of groups and started on that, which was really super rewarding. I had just been doing my little project all by myself, because that's how I tend to operate. Not really thinking it would go anywhere. I didn't start out thinking I was going to restore a block of creek and put in this incredibly popular meadow in my front yard or anything like that. I just thought, well, I'll take away some weeds and plant some native plants and see what happens. And it ended up really snowballing. The trail itself was so popular that the consortium of groups never had a problem getting volunteers to do weeding and stuff. People got super excited about it, and planting and that kind of thing. And they're still working on that project. The trails, Salida now has, I think, more than 24 miles of trails in town and around town that connect to literally hundreds of miles of trails in the public land outside town. It's a pretty hip spot for the recreation nation these days. And I threw in the picture in the bottom because I just thought it was so charming use of the trail. Here's 2 kids that are headed for Salida's big Whitewater Fest, Fibark, in June. And they've got their short, stubby wave rider rodeo kayaks sitting on skateboards. And each of them has their paddle in their hands, and they are pulling themselves down the path along my block of creek to the river so they can join the kayak rodeo. I just thought it was just super cute. Was weeding one day and looked over and went, oh my God, what a great way to transport yourself and your skateboard. One of the coolest things that came out of the Creek Project was the GARNA, Greater Arkansas River Nature Association, one of the nonprofits that's a cooperator with the federal lands in town, started a youth ecological literacy program with the local public schools. Salida's a little place. It's about 5,000 people. The county is only about 36 or 40,000 people. So it's not a big school district. They didn't have a lot of money. And GARNA decided that they could augment the school's basically field science programs by getting grants and offering these programs to teachers. And one of the things they did, they took the kids out on field trips to different places with different volunteers helping out. And one of the things they did was decide that the 6th graders would learn water testing. And all the 6th graders would do water testing as part of their ecological literacy program in 6th grade. And the first year they did it, they came and asked me if I would help out and if they could sample the water in my block. And the idea was start at the upstream end and sample where the creek ran into this restored block where I'd restored the native vegetation, the riparian zone, and then sample the water below that block and see if there was any difference, which was a super cool idea. I mean, it's pretty simple. And they got a grant for the water testing kits. I think there was 120 kids, and I think they got 60 kits for one for every two kids. And we went out there and spent the whole day with 126 graders in shifts doing water testing. And let me tell you, you have not lived until you have spent the day with 120 excited sixth graders on a pretty day in Salida trying to get them to do water testing. Oy vey. But they did. They tested temperature, dissolved oxygen, E. coli and other biological toxins, fertilizers and other chemical toxins, and heavy metals. And the idea was to see if the water was closer to trout quality as it came out of this restored block where the riparian vegetation was restored. So we tested above and we tested below. And it's pretty simple, but if you're a sixth grader and you're outside and you're excited, it may be hard to focus. So when we looked at the results, there were some that were so far out on the edges of the cloud of data that we axed those out. But the cluster in general showed that below my block, the water temperature was lower, which is better. The dissolved oxygen was higher, which is way better. The E. coli was down to pretty negligible levels. The pesticides and herbicides were down to much more tolerable levels, and the heavy metals were way down. So overall, the water quality had improved significantly just running through that block. And what was happening there? What was happening is that the riparian vegetation along the stream was acting like a sponge. It was not only exhaling oxygen into the water to raise the oxygen content and shading the water to lower the temperatures in the hot part of the day. You can see below this culvert that the water is completely unshaded and it gets pretty warm during the day. It's not a big stream. It was each root has positive and negatively charged particles and also microbes associated with it. And as the water was running across the streambank willow and the other native plant roots, it was getting cleaned in one block. Now, mind you, after a big storm event, when it's a flood flow, it's not going to be that effective. But on a day-to-day basis, that block was cleaning the water. And those results were actually one of the reasons that the county and the city both signed on to this cooperative project to continue removing invasive weeds and restoring native plants along the whole trail section. So that was a super, super, super cool result. So I laugh because I spent 19 and a half years of my life as a volunteer on a research project that I would never have started if I had sat down and said, okay, this is what I'm going to do for the next 19 and a half years in all of my spare time with essentially no budget, $100 here or $100 there for plants. But I started with this and the adjacent industrially altered landscape. And out of it came these marvelous, marvelous results, not just for the property where I lived and which I stewarded with my late husband and my stepdaughter, but for the neighborhood and the town as a whole. And I would honestly, if I had thought about it, I would never have gotten into it. It was a very big project as it worked out. But I did a little bit at a time. I weeded a little bit at a time. I reestablished native plants a little bit at a time. And it really grew into something super significant. And when I think of this project, I think of this quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer, an amazing native botanist who draws on both her native knowledge and her science in all of her work. She says, for the earth to stay in balance, for the gifts to continue to flow, we must give back in equal measure to what we take. We need a reciprocal relationship with the world beyond our human skin boundaries. We must give back in equal measure to what we take. And that is what inspired this project, the ditch in the meadow. There's the meadow in the inset. That was my front yard meadow in July. And there's the creek. And you can see the difference in that creek. Look at that picture and look at that industrial site. And then look at this. It was a very, very powerful project. And it ranks as my favorite of all the urban restoration projects I've done. Smallest budget, most work, but wow, what a wonderful thing. And it rippled outward into the community in ways I could never have imagined. So thank you all.